The ports went silent. Cargo ships stood frozen against steel-gray horizons, their containers stacked high with goods the world may never see. Markets trembled. Behind closed doors in Washington and Brussels, voices lowered as a new economic battlefield took shape. This wasn't a war of tanks and missiles. It was a war of tariffs. Walls built not with concrete, but with taxes meant to choke economies, shift alliances, and test the loyalty of nations. And at the center of this storm stood Donald Trump, demanding that Europe double down on his strategy. Tariffs of up to 100% on China and India. The two nations keeping Russia's economy alive as its war in Ukraine dragged into its fourth bloody year. The question was no longer if the world could afford another trade war. The question was whether it could survive one. On a tense September morning, President Trump picked up the phone and addressed European officials. His message was blunt: join the U.S. in hitting China and India with tariffs of historic magnitude, or stand aside as America acts alone. The reasoning was simple but ruthless. Both China and India have become Russia's lifelines. Together, they buy millions of barrels of discounted Russian oil, funneling billions into Moscow's war chest. Without them, Putin's war machine would sputter. With them, it continues to grind forward, bombarding Kiev, striking Donbass, and silencing civilians in pension lines. Trump framed tariffs as the ultimate pressure valve. Not sanctions, not diplomacy. Pure economic pain. Goods from China and India would face border taxes of 50%, 75%, even 100%. Electronics, textiles, steel, medicines, anything that moved would be taxed into near extinction on Western markets. America first was his banner. But this time, America was asking Europe to carry it too. The reaction was swift. In Beijing, officials denounced Washington's demands as economic coercion. China insisted it would not be used as a pawn in the West's war with Russia. Its foreign ministry bristled. We oppose any attempt to link China to the conflict in Ukraine. India's stance was more complex, but no less defiant. Prime Minister Narendra Modi reminded the world that India's first responsibility was to its 1.4 billion citizens. Oil, he argued, had to come from wherever the best deal was found, whether from Saudi wells or Russian pipelines. Yet even as Trump threatened punishment, India was finalizing a historic free trade agreement with the European Union. 65% of the chapters were already complete. 6,000 European companies were operating in India. Bilateral trade had doubled in a decade. And behind the curtain, Modi was preparing to speak directly with Trump, offering both optimism and warning. New Delhi would not bow easily. The stakes were enormous. For the United States, tariffs risked unleashing a firestorm at home. American consumers, already bruised by inflation, would see the cost of everyday goods skyrocket. Smartphones, cheap clothing, auto parts, pharmaceuticals, products sourced from Asia would surge in price. Wall Street analysts warned of a tariff tax on ordinary Americans, one that could dwarf even the oil shocks of the 1970s. For India, the threat was existential, but also opportunistic. Europe was its largest trading partner, and the ink on its trade pact promised billions in new markets. At the same time, a $100 billion deal with the European Free Trade Association and fresh partnerships with the UK gave India options. If the US slammed its doors, Europe might open wider. China, however, was built for economic sieges. Its belt and road networks stretched across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. If Washington and Brussels turned hostile, Beijing would deepen ties with the global South, accelerate de-dollarization through BRICS, and expand trade in yuan. For every Western door closed, another would be forced open in Shanghai, Lagos, or Sao Paulo. Global markets trembled. The IMF warned of fractured trade routes, the WTO of a splintered global economy. Ships idled in U.S. ports while new cargo lanes stretched toward Asia. The message was clear. Tariffs would not just hurt rivals. They would redraw the world's economic map. Tariffs were never just about money. They were about power and the alliances that wield it. By targeting India and China together, Trump risked welding two uneasy giants closer than ever before. Already bound by BRICS, both nations now saw shared pressure from the West. Beijing whispered of an Asian century, while Delhi weighed whether U.S. friendship was worth the cost of sovereignty. Europe, too, faced a fracture. Brussels had long preferred sanctions, cutting off Russia through law and diplomacy rather than tariffs. Now, Washington was demanding Europe change course, even as 19% of EU gas imports still came from Russia. Would Europe bend, risking its fragile economies, or resist, risking its transatlantic bond? At the United Nations, diplomats spoke of double standards. How could Washington demand a tariff crusade when its own oil companies once thrived in Moscow? At the IMF and WTO, officials warned of systemic collapse. At BRICS summits, leaders smiled knowingly. Every Western tariff was another incentive to build an alternative world order. Cinematic images played out across the globe. Ships idle in American ports, while new routes open in Shanghai. European farmers protest in the streets as food imports dry up. In Delhi, negotiators sip tea with EU officials, determined to finalize history's largest trade pact. And in Moscow, Putin watches as the West struggles with the weight of its own strategy. The story of tariffs is not just about taxes, it is about the shifting gravity of global power. For decades, America set the rules of trade, but rules only work when others obey them. Now, two of the world's largest nations, one the factory of the globe, the other its rising consumer giant, are testing the limits of that obedience. If Trump succeeds, Russia may weaken. If he fails, America may discover that tariffs do not isolate its enemies. They isolate itself. History may record it this way. America was not pushed out. It was quietly replaced. Is this how superpowers fade? Not with shock, but with silence? With tariffs instead of treaties? With allies drifting while rivals unite? Tell us what you think. Is Trump's strategy bold survival or reckless surrender? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this story, and don't forget to subscribe. Because this isn't just a trade war. It's the front line of a new world order.